But if you look at merely over the last year or so, the disappearance of the foreign minister, the disappearance of the defense minister, several senior generals in the rocket force, which is the elite of the PLA, this is not a sign of a stable system, and it's not a sign of a system which is without dissent and unease.
I mean, do you think it is in any way realistic? Maybe not immediately because he seems pretty secure, but maybe in 5 years' time, if the economy is still stagnant, that Xi's personal position could come under threat?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything's possible. I remember interviewing not so long ago Ai Weiwei, the exiled Chinese artist, and I asked him precisely that question. And he said sometimes if you look at Chinese history, when the emperor has appeared to be at their strongest, they've been at their weakest. And yes, he looks very powerful. He systematically has eliminated opposition. But if you look at merely over the last year or so, the disappearance of the foreign minister, the disappearance of the defense minister, several senior generals in the rocket force, which is the elite of the PLA, this is not a sign of a stable system. And it's not a sign of a system which is without dissent and unease. How will that play out? That's very difficult to tell. But I do think that anything is possible, particularly when you look at the way the economy is stalling at the moment.
What do you think the impact will be on the wider world, and in particular, the long-standing fear that China could launch an invasion of Taiwan? I was speaking recently to Robin Nibbler, the former director of Chatham House, and he said he thinks that a weaker Chinese economy is worse for the world in the long term because the Chinese Communist Party feels some need to reassert its strength, and that could lead to, for example, an invasion of Taiwan. Do you think that is a realistic assessment?
I think it is very realistic because already the Communist Party is effectively a nationalist party, and it is an increasingly rabid nationalist party, this breed of sort of Han nationalist feeling, which resents anything which is different, whether this is the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, whether it is Taiwan trying to assert its separate and unique identity and culture. And I think that there will be a temptation, we see it everywhere with autocrats under pressure, that when you face economic difficulties, you resort to nationalist rhetoric, you resort to chauvinism. On the one hand, I think an invasion of Taiwan would be very difficult along conventional means. It would be well signposted. It would take such a large contingent of soldiers and equipment. Taiwan is not an easy place to invade for multiple reasons, but arguably an invasion of sorts is already taking place through grey means, whether these are cyber attacks, endless military harassment, disinformation, misinformation warfare. This is a day-to-day reality for Taiwan. But I do think there is a danger that the nationalism could be stepped up, could be ramped up as the economic difficulties grow greater.
Just to go back to the title of your new book, you called China the vampire state. What do you mean by that?
Well, this was inspired by a book that came out in 1939. It was written by a German he was an economist, but also an author. His pen name was Gunther Reimann. And he wrote a book called The Vampire Economy, Doing Business Under Fascism. And it was about how the Nazi Party bent the economy and business to its will, whether this was through coercion or, in many cases, collaboration by a lot of companies with the Nazis. And I was amazed and struck by going through that book, how you could put a line through Nazi Party and replace it with Chinese Communist Party. And seamlessly, it would read like a contemporary book about the Chinese economy. So that was the inspiration for it. But I also think it's a very good way of looking at it, because it is this vampire, this bloodsucker, who is drawing in all these resources, who through coercion, through predatory practices, is very much taking advantage of companies and economies which have been quite naive in their dealings with China over the years.
We're talking of vampires. We're recording this in the week of Halloween. Do you want to tell us what's happening in China around Halloween?
Yeah, it is remarkable. I mean, Halloween is big in China. It sometimes surprises people that it is, and there are costume parties, some of which are officially sanctioned. But this week, the police in Shanghai and other cities have been busy stopping gatherings of people in fancy dress, leading away, arresting Superman, Batman, Donald Trump with a plaster on his ear. And the reason for this is to stop a repeat of last year when the costumes included a surveillance camera and people in hazmat uniforms parodying the fairly brutal lockdown that happened during the COVID pandemic. And the authorities don't want to see a repeat of that. So they are physically preventing gatherings around China of people in fancy dress, and also trying to prevent the proliferation of memes and wordplay on the Chinese internet, which has become a key technique of internet users in China as a way of having discussions and sidestepping the draconian censorship laws. Now, that leads to another element of what's happening, which, of course, China is trying to upgrade the Great Firewall, its system of censorship, and there have been new directives to try and stop the proliferation of memes, the proliferation of wordplay to get round these controls. So it's interesting in itself that the party should feel so paranoid and fearful about, spooked, shall we say, by Halloween, that it is actively stopping these gatherings. But it's also a test of these new controls on the internet, which trying to stop an area, a loophole, which has been quite actively exploited by those still trying to maintain a degree of freedom of expression.
And on the point about COVID, is there any sense within the Chinese Communist Party, which I appreciate as an organisation is probably not great at self-criticism and self-reflection, but is there any sense that they dropped the ball over COVID and they overreacted, and that their draconian lockdowns and measures and limitations on people's freedoms harmed the Chinese economy and Chinese society? It
did. It harmed both. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that the lockdown, the restrictions, which were the most draconian in the world, had a very bad effect on the economy and on confidence within China. I think that you will never get them to admit that, and people are very cautious in China about criticising the party. But there's no doubt, I think, that there were serious issues, that the economy was hit badly. There was an assumption that the economy would emerge from COVID and would bounce back quite quickly. That was the assumption of a lot of Western economists. But that hasn't happened because the economic issues that China faces are too fundamental. And it wasn't just about COVID, but COVID certainly played an impact, and I think it also quite badly hit confidence. And one of the things that's lacking at the moment in China, whether it's among consumers or among companies, is confidence in the economic management of the country. There's always been this notion that, China's a technocratic society. Unlike us, it can think long term. We put the technocrats in charge. Well, that's fine as long as you've got someone that will listen to the technocrats, because it doesn't matter how good your civil servants are, how good your technocrats are. If you've got an emperor who only wants to hear what he wants to hear, then it doesn't matter about the quality of the information that's being passed to that person if they don't act upon it.
Just finally, we are less than a week away now from the US presidential election. If you are the Chinese Communist Party, what is your preferred outcome from that?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult one, because who do you opt for? Trump won. He began as a big fan of the autocrats. He said very positive things about Putin, about Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, about Xi. But later in his presidency, he completely changed the conversation about China. Of course, when Biden came to power, he continued those sanctions, those tariffs, and in fact intensified them. And the chances are that Harris would continue that Biden policy. I think Trump is more of an unknown. He has threatened massive increases in tariffs, but would he go through with that? A positive for Beijing is that the more Trump alienates his allies and undermines alliances, that's a positive for China. That's something which is good. But how do you balance that against the potential intensification of he's a wild card to China. Who knows what's going to come along? So I think perhaps there might be a preference more for Biden continuity, because at least you know what you're dealing with, than the uncertainty of a Trump presidency.
And potentially, I've heard some people say that, for example, what Russia really wants, even though, yes, probably Russia would rather have Trump, and maybe you're right, maybe the Chinese Communist Party would rather have Harris on balance. But what both of them really want is a kind of very fractious, divided country. They want controversy over the legitimacy of the election results. Any kind of internal dissent in America is good for China and it's good for Russia.
Absolutely. That's the key bottom line. One of the mantras of both the Russians and the Chinese is that the West is in decline. It's split, it's decadent, its time is over. And the more that happens in Washington, in Europe, to support that thesis is a plus for both countries. So divisiveness is what they're after, and it's just a question of what outcome is most likely to bolster that for them.
Ian, as ever, a pleasure to speak to you. Ian's new book is called Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian Williams, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.